Well, welcome all, and welcome to one of our regular coffee breaks. We're doing something of a departure this time, and we're having our first special guest. And our special guest today is Sara Hutton of the imaginatively named Sara Hutton Consulting Limited. As many of you will know, Sarah's background is the RBS NatWest Group, which she escaped from probably 3 years ago now. So welcome, Sara.
Sara, am I right in saying that you've actually held several firms' hands through the CBILS process? So you can actually look at this from both sides, because I think you've got some sympathy, haven't you, for the poor relationship managers who've been pulled from pillar to post on it?
Yeah, and especially in the early few weeks, the process wasn't embedded. They changed policy because the British Bank, Business Bank, changed its rules slightly in response to the pressure from other external parties and politically around the guarantee issue and the assessment of bank viability. And then some of the larger banks were under a lot of pressure in terms of the amount of financial information they were looking for. So they stood back and said, well, we only expect you to provide the financial information you've effectively got to hand. We realise you haven't got time to go back to your advisors and get chapter and verse on everything, and we'll just use whatever information we've got. And then they were just about getting on top of the CBILS, which is for the up to 45 million turnover, up to a £5 million loan. And then lo and behold, the bounce back loans got thrown in. And then they got told that they had to approve them and draw them down in 24 hours from scratch. And yes, the government is providing full guarantee, but they still need a process. They still need an application. They still need people to self-certify that they actually meet the criteria. And so they've had to take a massive amount of resource out of just about regrouping and servicing the demand for CBILS to reinvent the whole thing again, but for something very, very different with very precise and promised turnaround times. But it wasn't the bank that was promising that, it was the government. So
what I'm seeing, and all right, you're getting the accountant's view here, I'm seeing really supportive, helpful frontline relationship managers, relationship directors, who are doing their absolute best to help their customers in difficult times and difficult circumstances, but they're being stymied by either the credit process or the securities department.
Yeah, I think that that's improving day by day, and I think that certainly there's been several surveys done to show that the sort of delivery of the debt and the time it's taking to deliver that debt is improving week on week, partly because the RMs are learning how to go about the process, and certainly the larger bit, it is very much a case of you can't generalise between the banks, because a lot of it depends on where the bank started from. Some banks had invested an awful lot in IT and process. Some banks were more reliant on overseas operations, like outsourcing of a lot of the process to India. India had got its own problems in lockdown. Some are just the basic IT of being able to get everybody working efficiently and effectively remotely, like every other business in the whole country. Some banks have struggled more with that. Some had got better secure communication links with clients already and secure portals. Trying to get security executed, for example, in a secure, compliant way that was enforceable was a challenge. And then some of the things where banks started to rein back on the idea of even trying to take new security. So as long as they had a mortgage debenture for the actual loan itself, a lot of the banks, notwithstanding the government change of stance around the 250 mark and no PGs, several of the banks came out and said they're not going to take PGs for any of the government scheme. So they've not tried, they've reduced massively that sort of blockage when it came to securities. So it very much depends on the individual bank. because apart, you mentioned about credit policy and credit process as well. Whilst most of them have gone to some sort of short form application form, there's still the requirement to assess ability to repay and that the debt is serviceable. Therefore, they need a certain amount of financial information to assess that. And the other thing is that some banks have got specific policies for law firms, and they won't lend to some parts of the sector. And they're not changing their core lending policies. Even things like a number of them have some sort of specific definition of cash available to service debt, for debt servicing, and they're still applying that measure. So they work out what your cash available for debt servicing is based on your 2019 performance. And if it can't substantiate the amount of the CBIL loan or the new loan that you're applying for, then the answer will come back no, but it's much more likely to come back as saying yes, but only this much.
Right.
The other thing is the change of policy is around what you're going to use the loan for, because some banks have made the decision that they will not lend for debt consolidation. Now the scheme allows you to, the scheme rules say you can borrow to repay more expensive debt.
Is that both CBILS and bounce back?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is, yeah.
Yes, but some banks' credit policy is that the loans will not be for debt consolidation.
Yeah, certainly on the CBILS, I was talking to someone who just said, the bank said, we don't have an appetite for this sector.
Yeah.
So you meet all the government requirements and the loans there, but the bank, even if you've got the right credit worthiness, although it's not about credit worthiness, can just say, well, no, it's not an area. And I think that's really quite unfair. And certainly with the bounce back loans, it should be easier. But what I gather, a lot of, given the turnaround times, banks are now just putting in waiting lists, join our waiting list to be considered for a bounce back loan.
Really, I haven't seen that. I've seen bounce back money come in very quickly.
Yeah. I've certainly, my experience of the bounce back scheme is it is actually working quite effectively. One of the difficulties that one bank had was that they set it up with the idea that it would only be business banking in their terms, because their turnover threshold for being in business bank was quite high. They felt that it would only be business banking that required the bounce back loans, but the commercial RMs have been getting applications for bounce back loans, but they've got no ability to actually provide them. So they're declining them, saying, well, we can't provide them because we haven't got a system. But there is variability. There's variability because of the quality of the RMs and their ability to, and also the amount of discretion some of them have got. Whichever bank you bank with now is one that you need to try and find your way around and navigate. And I would certainly say that if you got a knockback in the first few weeks, you should be trying again.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt there, but that brings us to the end of part one of our chat with Sara Hutton on all things banking. But do watch out for part 2 and part 3 coming to a laptop on the internet to you in the near future. With it, but you haven't been too disparaging about anyone there anyway.
I've tried to watch my P's and Q's, definitely.
Now we can get you to do the real bit, and we're still recording.
Yeah. Turn that record button off. Turn that record button.